It was the one part of China that every year commemorated the 1989 Tiananmen Square pro-democracy uprising. Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate. Hong Kong activists reduced to pocket protests, lighting candles in windows, as local authorities, evoking COVID-19 and sanitary reasons, have banned the usual June 4th rallies. Now, this coming days after Beijing announced a new security law that could effectively submit Hong Kongers to the same censorship as the mainland. China wants to once and for all put a stop to the pro-democracy movement in that former British colony. But at what price? The US is threatening to pull the plug on Hong Kong's special status, one that cements its position as the world's third biggest financial center. The UK Prime Minister is considering a path to citizenship for 3 million Hong Kong residents. There's the financial cost of the standoff, and you could say the political cost. With a worldwide pandemic on, Beijing knows the West has other priorities right now than Hong Kong, but the rivalry is not going away. And as for COVID-19, which originated in China, it shines the spotlight on a model where human rights has been thrown into the mix of scrutiny over a public health response that has had consequences for the rest of the planet. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at China and Hong Kong, and joining us from Hong Kong is barrister and pro-democracy activist William Lang. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We want to welcome from London, Elizabeth Braw, Senior Research Fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And from Paris, he's a commentator and entrepreneur, André Lezecourt-Petry, founder of A Capital. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, François Picard.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. Gosh, remember 1 year ago, it was the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square and those tanks rolling into China's capital. The focus there was squarely on China then and now. Today, this Thursday, the focus is squarely on Hong Kong.
Footage of the Tiananmen Square massacre is projected onto the bodies of these artists ahead of the 4th of June anniversary. Usually a huge event in Hong Kong, but this year commemorations are banned.
We think in coming future, not far away, or even now, the pressure from Chinese government or from the Hong Kong government is changing. We should have the basic right to talk about what we feel in our daily life.
The official reason is social distancing concerns, but many Hong Kongers fear a crackdown after Beijing passed a national security law taking aim at subversion and separatism, effectively outlawing the pro-democracy movement. After the US pledged to strip Hong Kong of its special trading status in response to the new law, on Wednesday the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson pledged that British national overseas passport holders will be able to come to the UK for 12 months, visa-free on a renewable basis, eventually leading to full citizenship. 2.5 million people could benefit. Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam accused the US and the UK of double standards.
It is within the legitimate jurisdiction of any country to enact laws to protect and safeguard national security. USA is no exception, UK is no exception.
A wave of protests broke out last year over Hong Kong's since-scrapped extradition law. But with this new legislation, Beijing has upped the ante, as pro-democracy leaders call on the international community for support.
Wilson Lang, full disclosure, it's a pre-record here. We're having our conversation before as night is falling in Hong Kong. But what has been the mood this June 4th where you are?
I think it's extremely somber. This is the first time in 31 years that the candlelight vigil has not been allowed in the city. And right now we see police patrolling the park, trying to prevent people from getting in. But I think more sobering than that is the thought that we may have seen the last of these vigils. There is a new national security law being imposed by Beijing. It's being drafted in Beijing right now. and is expected to crack down very harshly on dissent and introduce mainland-style censorship to Hong Kong. And we've already seen some of the top Chinese leaders suggesting that the Tiananmen Vigil will be banned in the future.
Will be banned in the future with or without COVID-19. You saw this coming even before last month's plenary in Beijing?
I think people didn't expect it to come so quickly. Last year, of course, there was a controversy about extraditing defendants from Hong Kong to China. And after a round of furious protests, that was put on hold. I think what was not expected is that they would come up with a much more draconian measure so soon after the protests. In effect, this new law brings China to Hong Kong. It's no longer necessary to send defendants from Hong Kong to China.
No longer necessary to send defendants to China. Elizabeth Brawl, your reaction?
Well, if I may point out, it's not just the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre today, but also 31 years ago since the protests in East Germany that were extremely instrumental in changing the destiny of that country and, as a result, the rest of Europe. So we are talking about very historic days this week, and of course, it's history is repeating itself in a sense, as we just heard from Hong Kong. So I think it's useful to have that historical perspective to consider it, because the Hong Kong residents who are out protesting or who would like to protest and assert their rights, they are not alone, just like East Germans were not alone, as it turned out 31 years ago.
So Elizabeth, on that point, you bring up what was going on in East Germany, the prelude to the fall of the Berlin Wall falling. It was a time when the whole global world order was in flux. Is that what you're suggesting is happening today?
Well, we could see the beginning of it. So if we think back to 1989, and it's something that I've dealt with extensively in a book about the end of East Germany. So 1989 started and everything seemed fine in East Germany, apart from a few East Germans gathering in churches to pray for peace and democracy, and that seemed completely irrelevant until those protests grew and they grew and they grew and they grew. And in the end, East Germany fell. I'm not saying that China is about to collapse in the same way, but all protests start small. And I think we should bear that in mind as we look at Hong Kong today. And it's also worth bearing in mind that not just was it East Germany that fell as a result of those protests in East Germany, it was at the end the whole Warsaw Pact. And China is, in a sense, you might say, the lone holdover, the lone communist country, supposedly communist country, still standing. And East Germans were worried back in 1989 whether they should send in the army like the Chinese had, and in the end they did not. And you could say the Chinese government saved itself, but can it still save itself? I think is the question we're asking in Hong Kong and maybe
can it still
China.
save itself, or Andre Lozokier-Petri, could it be a 1989 in reverse that we're witnessing? Remember, at the time there was a spread of liberal democracies in a lot of countries. Could it be the opposite?
Yeah, I don't want to add my own historic date with June the 6th and the D-Day, but I think we are seeing really history accelerating at an incredible pace. I mean, 4 months ago, there was barely no COVID-19 crisis. Since a week, we are seeing these extraordinary events in the US unfolding. And I would kind of agree with you, Francois, is the concept of democracy as we see it from a European standpoint. I'm here in Europe, and how we can see it even in the US, is we always thought that it was kind of the goal where history was going to, and this is absolutely not the case. I mean, even in the US, you probably heard the former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis had words against his own president, which are unprecedented. That means that we are really in the middle of a battle of systems. And we should be very, very careful about thinking that one system will prevail at the end. That's absolutely not sure. So we have to be really careful everywhere that our values are defended. and crisis is actually both a risk but also an opportunity for some systems to push their advantage, and that is what we are seeing very clearly, both on the technological front. I mean, space race is going on like never before during this crisis, and now we see these events in Hong Kong. So it's both extraordinary to watch and probably very, very frightening for people who are dearly attached to our liberal democracies as Europeans are.
And Hong Kong, that the fact that it is more open makes it that financial trading place. However, what we've seen, Andre Lozier-Petri, is executives there falling in line. The latest example coming Wednesday over the Chinese social media app WeChat. Peter Wong, who's the head for the region for the big bank HSBC, saying that under the one country, two systems principle, HSBC respects and supports all laws that stabilize Hong Kong's social order and boost the economy to develop prosperously. He signed that petition supporting the security law that Wilson Leung was denouncing a moment ago.
Absolutely, and I think companies will increasingly be stuck between these two forces, and they will be forced to take sides, and it's going to be, I will quote our French Prime Minister, who called this crisis as a set of bad decisions, and he had to choose between them. And I think this is exactly the case for companies. Probably the time we're witnessing will be also the time for extraordinary leaders to stand out. That means people who are ready to take short-term losses. And
so does a bank like HSBC have a future in Hong Kong?
Well, the big question is, can corporates who are only focused on bottom line can survive? And probably the answer is increasingly no. The companies, because they have hundreds and thousands of employees, because they have a financial power which is unprecedented after globalization, will increasingly have a political role, which of course has the whole question with it is, what is the legitimacy? Are they exerting this role with some balance of powers? I think increasingly Hong Kong as a financial center, and that's only the investor who's speaking, I think to take the words which were spoken out just before, has a very somber future, that's for sure. I mean, Hong Kong was an exception. In all logic, even from a Beijing point of view, it should have been preserved because it brought a lot to the country. I think it's only 2 or 3% of the GDP today, but it's still more than the majority of the inward financial flows and investment flows still go through Hong Kong, probably more than ever, in a moment where obviously China itself is also in the midst of going backwards or advancing on reforms. We hear different stories from the Prime Minister and from the President. So Hong Kong was kind of the way to be still into the international financial and industrial system. If this exception falls, I think there will be only losers in it.
Wilson Leung, what's the trend going forward? We know outside investors prefer doing business in Hong Kong than they do in places like Shanghai. But when you see the delisting of companies on the US stock exchange by the Trump administration, when you see that threat of lifting the special trade status, what's the trend going forward? Will Beijing in the future still need Hong Kong as a financial center?
I think they should need Hong Kong. As Andre pointed out, most of the foreign direct investment still goes through Hong Kong. Most of the IPOs of Chinese companies are still going through Hong Kong. You see, for example, Alibaba, probably fearing delisting, actually had a secondary listing in Hong Kong last year in the middle of the protests. So it's still an important financial center, or should be. But the problem is Beijing's move to exert control over the territory actually conflict with that and impose severe harm on the autonomy of Hong Kong and its ability to act as a financial center. Now, one example is this.
And on that point,
yeah.
on that very point, Wilson, there's been the argument made, Beijing knows it's going to be financial pain, but sometimes it's not about the economy. It's willing to pay that price because, in this case, politics matters more.
The problem is that it's probably a misdiagnosis, because the whole theory behind the law is that Hong Kong has a bunch of pro-independence separatists who are funded and organized by foreign forces. And so it's so important to clamp down on it. But in fact, this is probably a figment of someone's imagination up in Beijing. I mean, the reality is these are pro-democracy protests. Very few people are asking for independence, and there's no evidence at all of any foreign forces. So they're actually misdiagnosing the disease, and they're applying a medicine which will in fact kill the patient. So it's a completely unfortunate situation.
Are you saying that Beijing doesn't get Hong Kong?
Yes, I think so, because we see that it listens to a small group of closely chosen pro-Beijing Hong Kongers, Carrie Lam, her cabinet, and so on. And unfortunately, we've seen from her statements that she misrepresents the situation in Hong Kong. For example, she says many people in Hong Kong support this law. She says she's heard positive things only about the law. But when you're actually here on the ground, you can see extremely wide opposition. So one recent survey was 62% of people are against it. So unfortunately, Beijing seems to have chosen to listen to people who are telling it what it wants to hear.
Elizabeth Brault, you agree that Beijing is out of touch when it comes to where its true interests perhaps lie here?
Well, if we look at any authoritarian government, and indeed many democratic governments, they are often out of touch simply because the leaders choose to listen to the people who tell them the things they want to hear. And it just a completely different example, but if we all remember, as we do, the invasion of Iraq, that was based on a gentleman called Ahmad Shalabi telling George W. Bush that the Iraqis would greet the Americans with open arms. Well, he just listened to the wrong person. I think that may be what's happening in Hong Kong, simply because it feels good as a leader to hear the things you want to hear that support the decision that you've already made.
And your reaction sitting in London to what Boris Johnson announced Wednesday, that there would be this eventual path to citizenship for somewhere between 2.5 million to 3 million Hong Kongers?
Well, it's an incredibly courageous step, and I think, we can discuss later, but I think it will be very much welcomed among Hong Kong citizens. And but it's not just courageous; it's a moral duty that the UK has, given that it did sign Hong Kong over to China on the basis that Hong Kong residents would be able to live in democracy and freedom. And if that's not guaranteed in Hong Kong, then they should get it here. Now, another aspect is how much the UK will be able to stand up to China on business and financial issues and trade issues, considering that it's going to be completely alone. It won't have the backing of the EU. In fact, it no longer has the backing of the EU, considering that we have left the EU. And so
it says it's reconsidering 5G, something that it hardens its stance towards Beijing. Exactly,
and that's a very positive step. It was a strange decision to go with Huawei for 5G, considering the security issues that are involved with that, regardless of whether Huawei was intending to use any backdoors. I think it's just extremely unfortunate to have in your critical national infrastructure a company that has close links to a government that often acts in a hostile fashion against your country. So it's just safer not to have Huawei part of it. And now the UK appears to have reversed this decision to include Huawei and seems to have decided to ban it or no longer use it.
Wilson Brault, do you agree with Elizabeth that it was a courageous decision made by Boris Johnson? Because I've heard Hong Kong activists say, well, the UK wasn't that interested in democracy when they were running the place.
Well, actually, that's interesting, because the historical records actually show that it was due to Chinese pressure, or at least the Chinese government put a lot of pressure on colonial Britain not to give greater democracy to Hong Kong. And of course, Chris Patten, the last governor in 1995, he enacted democratic reforms, which were then promptly rolled back by Beijing in 1997. But I do agree it's a courageous step, but it's also the right step. Hong Kong people are some of the most entrepreneurial people, some of the hardest working people, and also in terms of the assets that each person has, one of the highest in the world. I think the figure is around 250,000 US in savings per person. So it's certainly something, in my view, which would benefit both Britain and also the people of Hong Kong who are looking for a democratic environment in which to thrive.
Andrei Lizakug-Petri?
Well, at this stage, I would like to cite the Nobel Prize for Peace, Elie Wiesel, who used to say, I think it was in his accepting speech of the prize, that silence only serves the oppressor, and that you need to speak out, and especially to take a side. And this is what James Mattis just did, and this is what probably Boris Johnson, which I think on his all other politics has completely failed, but that's just an outsider's view. But on this one, I think it's he has probably taken a courageous step, which we cannot see at all on the continent. And I think the continent thinks it can. That means the EU, especially, and the big national capitals, Paris, Germany, etc. And I think it's a very wrong step to do, because that is really underestimating or misjudging how China works. Is you're always more respected when you take sides and you have clear opinions.
But haven't we seen, Andre, since the beginning of this crisis, statements saying we're too dependent on China, statements complaining about the fact that it is a national security risk, even in areas not just 5G technology, but also pharmaceuticals and face masks?
We are. The thing is that I don't want to be cynical today, but liberal democracies need to change and go away from the announcement democracies, which we have today in many European capitals, to the action democracies. And at the end of the day, if we want to have our system survive, the citizen will only value those systems who are acting upon their values. And this is what makes actually me very worried, that it's not about authoritarian versus democracy. Is I think citizens will want to see that their leaders are actually standing by their word. And this is why populists are so attractive these days, because they have this stance saying, we do what we said. And we rather do that fast in Europe, because otherwise the next crisis will come and we will lament that we have no masks or no ventilators.
All right. One issue where European leaders will have to pay attention is China's street cred, if you will, among voters. And we saw an illustration of an area where China's come in for a lot of criticism, and that is its initial response to the COVID-19 crisis. The Associated Press publishing a report Wednesday that takes a closer look at whether or not Beijing pressured the World Health Organization into downplaying the importance of the pandemic at the outset. Alan Gainsford has more.
Back in January of this year, the World Health Organization was, in public, praising China for its rapid response to COVID-19, and even lauding Beijing's transparency. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. According to a report by the Associated Press, Beijing was releasing its data with a deliberate delay, waiting a week to reveal the genetic map of the virus, and 2 weeks for the data on patients and cases. This, according to recordings of internal meetings held by the UN Health Agency. China has categorically denied the accusations.
我不知道你所说的内部消息从何而来，我可以明确地告诉你，有关报道与事实严重不符。中国的抗疫行动对全世界公开， 时间经纬清清楚楚，事实数据一目了然，经得起时间与历史的检验。
Beijing has refused to cooperate with a potential international inquiry into the origins of the virus, sparking anger from the US. Donald Trump accused the WHO of being a puppet of China and has frozen US funding for the organization, a total of 22% of its overall budget.
Elizabeth Braw, COVID-19, how will it impact China ultimately? Will it be the China that downplayed at the outset, or the China that talked very loudly about how it was helping the rest of the world once it got in gear?
Well, I think COVID-19 coronavirus has dramatically changed the perception of China, the image of China around the world. So if you remember, just a few months ago, China was seen as a credible ally, one that could replace America, because Trump was seen as completely undependable, and he remains that. But China was seen as the country that could replace the US. It was a dependable ally, and it sold itself very well as that. And it was, by the way, part of that campaign that made China so successful in lobbying for Huawei, because it was seen as just another country, a little bit different from us. And then in just these past few weeks, not a very long time at all, has managed to squander all of that, almost all of that goodwill or good image they used to have, simply because it has been obfuscating about the origins of the virus and hiding the extent of it, and this has turned out that it was pressuring the World Health Organization. And as for the aid that it was supposedly sending to other countries, that was mostly commercial transactions. Very little of it was good Samaritanship. And when those products arrived, as we know, they were often defective. So a complete, almost complete change in image for China for the worse.
Wilson Lang, will COVID-19 be a turning point for China?
I think it is a wake-up call to the world. Of course, we've seen, we know about the initial problems, such as the cover-up, the arrest of the whistleblower doctors, and so on. But I think what's probably even more infuriating is the reaction of China afterwards. We've seen the sort of wolf warrior diplomacy, as it's called. The Chinese diplomats coming out very aggressively to any criticisms. So, for example, the spokesman that we just saw in the video, Zhao Lijian, he accused the U.S. of perhaps starting the virus during the military games. We've seen them rattle their sabers in Taiwan Straits in the South China Sea at the same time as the pandemic is going on. And in Hong Kong, they've also taken the opportunity to arrest prominent pro-democracy leaders and also now enact this security law. So it is a China that not only made initial mistakes, but seems to have no shame at all in acting in the authoritarian, aggressive manner.
But it works to a large degree, Wilson. We had a scandal last month where it turns out that the EU had signed this letter to China, pretty soft, and it was an open letter published in an official publication, and the Chinese had censored it with the consent of some of the ambassadors, taking out the reference to the fact that COVID-19 began in China. It brings back to what Andre was talking about earlier. Ultimately, will China get away with it?
Yeah, and speaking of the EU, there's also the misinformation report, which they toned down. It seems that countries are waking up, but some countries are slower at waking up than others. So probably at the front of waking up is US and its Five Eyes allies, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK. And it seems that right now, who's a bit slower in waking up is the EU.
A little bit slower waking up the EU. You mentioned that Chinese government spokesperson. He has had no shortage of words when it comes to events that have been transpiring over the past week in the United States. Let's listen.
当前事态再次反映了美国国内种族歧视、警察暴力执法等问题的严重性和解决有关问题的紧迫性。希望美国政府采取切实措施，履行其根据消除一切形式种族歧视国际公约应承担的义务，维护和保障少数族裔的合法权利。
The legitimate rights of ethnic minorities, Andrei Lizakug-Pietri. Do the Chinese understand how this is landing when they make these kinds of statements that here in the West are laughed at? It's as seeing as the pot calling the kettle black.
Yes, but we should remember we live in a world that we think is one, but that's actually extremely divided. And look at all the debates about conspiracy theories. You can try to go with rational arguments. You're just bringing the two parties more convinced about their own thinking. And this message is actually landing probably very well with people who deeply believe that there's some truth to it and who are watching the demonstrations currently in the US. So I think we have to be careful. I just heard the two comments before that we are not, again, thinking that what's happening is what we desire. I think that China is very strategically pushing its advantage. Probably historians will study how it's what an opportunity for the two leaders. I mean, Donald Trump feeds from Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping feeds from Donald Trump. It's interesting how both are kind of building on each other to support their case, which I obviously I'm not completely in agreement.
They feed off one another. They trade with one. They trade with one another as well.
And we have to be. And I come back to this European. I think it's going to be unpardonable for the Europeans to wake up late, because today being late is being wrong, and in any case, and we saw that with the pandemic. A late start costed probably France 20 or 30,000 more deaths than its neighbor Germany. Just to give you this example. So we live in a time where it's not just about right and wrong, but it's also about on time or late, and this is probably the wake-up call of what's happening today. We see China systematically pushing its interest. We have to be careful not to look at China with the rationality that we have in European capitals. I mean, there is no rationality from a Cartesian point of view of what's going on in Hong Kong, but it's happening. So it's probably a long game. It's probably a different perspective. It's probably a different value system. I don't say one is better than the other, but if some want to preserve theirs, we rather gather. And I think what happened at the EU Commission is unacceptable. We are still waiting for consequences. We don't see any changes, personal changes, strategic changes. And so long the geopolitical commission that Ursula von der Leyen wants. I think she ideally wants, the president of the commission wants it to change. It's time to show it, and probably what's going on right now, both in the US and in China, is an opportunity to wake up. If we don't wake up, I think we will be the last ones to switch off the light.
It's June 4th, the anniversary of Tiananmen, and coincidence of the calendar or not, India and Australia have signed a defense and cybersecurity agreement this day. They staged a virtual summit between the Australian and Indian prime ministers. Your reaction to that, Elizabeth Brawl, and does this signal, again, we're heading towards a new kind of Cold War?
Well, it has been said many times that we're heading towards a new Cold War. I think it's a different geopolitical standoff this time. It's not two blocs against one another, because we should remember China has no friends, only has countries which it has coerced, whereas back during the Cold War, the Soviet Union really did have its communist friends, even though those countries were not as closely linked to the Soviet Union.
Hang on, you say no friends. There's a lot of countries in Africa which consider China a friend. There's Pakistan. There's other countries in Southeast Asia. It's got friends.
Well, it only has commercial friends. The moment Chinese investments and Chinese loans stop, I can bet you anything those countries will give up their friendship with China, and rightfully so, because they don't have an ideology in common. What they need from China, or what they accept from China, is investments and infrastructure construction. But that's a very transactional relationship. Whereas
what should we be reading into this defense agreement between India and Australia?
Well, I'm reading into it that two countries that have been subjected to Chinese gray zone aggression, especially in cyber, are saying, well, now we're going to team up and better defend ourselves. And we should remember that they both have strong commercial ties with China, both trade a lot with China. So they have a lot to lose by taking a stand against China, but at least they can team up with each other because they are both democracies. And we should remember that China's global financial and economic expansion hasn't just happened on the level playing field. It has happened thanks to Chinese industrial espionage conducted in cyberspace. So it has really been undermining the global playing field in business. And that is a very dangerous situation, because if globalization doesn't work according to the rules that we have all agreed it should work, that it should be using, then globalization just doesn't work at all.
Wilson Leung, this escalation between superpowers, how will it impact Hong Kong in any way?
I think Elizabeth talked about earlier it being like 1989. I'm more pessimistic, and I think it's more like the 1950s. And it seems like a curtain is falling between the authoritarian world and the democratic world. And at the moment, unfortunately, it seems like Hong Kong is going to fall on the wrong side of that curtain.
And I've seen it said that even if Donald Trump is voted out of office in November, that escalation is going to continue.
I think we can see from the especially what's happening in the U.S. Congress, the various bills relating to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Uyghurs, and Tibetans. They're almost overwhelmingly passed on a bipartisan basis. So I think this wariness towards China, then this waking up, at least in the U.S., is very much a bipartisan consensus.
Sorry, it needs a bipartisan consensus, is what you're saying.
It is a bipartisan consensus, although there may be some debates about what's the best way to do it.
Andrei Luzakiuk-Pietri?
Well, on this one, I think if Joe Biden gets elected against Donald Trump in November, it will change something. I completely agree that a lot of stances, especially on the technology side that I'm following, are bipartisan. Think about what's going on in the artificial intelligence realm. But the fact that a curtain and this feeding I was mentioning, and look at how the spokesperson of the foreign ministry actually is using the riots in the US, or the demonstrations, I should say, in the US, to show that the model, or at least to try to make a case that the model does not work. Actually, this will probably not happen anymore. So actually, the Iron Curtain was probably at the beginning, I'm not a historian, also a way to strengthen the two blocs. And hopefully we can expect a much smarter, much more engaging, and a much less confrontational attitude from the US. And this will probably undermine the hardliners in each side. And I think that
Andre, I've heard it said from French businessmen who've told me, hey, it's a lot I disagree with Donald Trump on, but on this one, he's right. And if he's doing a much better job than Barack Obama ever did, you have to toe a hard line. You said so yourself.
No, absolutely. I mean, the fact that I'm distinguishing between the wake up and the operational modus. having a Pacific partner, a TPP, remember that was this Trans-Pacific Partnership, would have probably brought the US commercially much more than the current trade deals, which are purely communication operations in the Oval Office. And we see that today this whole rhetoric is actually only harming trade, but actually not getting a clear winner. What I want to say is that probably now that the wake-up call that China is not an only benevolent new player and plays the multilateral game, this wake-up call has happened everywhere in the world. And now the question is, how do you best strategically defend the interest? We should be careful. What I see right now in the world is that we have a strategic power, which sits in Beijing. We have probably power which is completely asleep, which is in Europe. And we have probably a mad dog, to take the expression how Jim Mattis was called by Donald Trump, in Washington. And I think at the end of the day, it's the strategist who wins. If we have more strategists in the room, I think the game will be more interesting.
Elizabeth Broad, this isn't an era for strategists, is it? It's an era for outrage and taking pointed stances. Again, does it matter really in the relationship between China and the rest of the world, the election in the fall in the US?
It matters, but what matters most, I think, is how industry, or how businesses, how global companies act. Because we should remember, when we talk about the relationship between China and the rest of the world, and we say, oh, Western government should do this, they should do that. Actually, they are to a large extent dependent on what their companies do. So we can say we should trade more with China, we should trade less with China. Actually, the trading happens between companies that export and import, and we should be less dependent on China. Well, that's up to companies whether they want to limit their supply chains to Chinese exposure, whether they want to decrease the Chinese part of their supply chain. So if companies, if they can start seeing the world in a geopolitical way, where they actually have a role to play in, for example, strengthening their own countries here in the West, then I think we have a much better chance in presenting a united front against China. And so the election of Donald Trump, I think, well, it of course have the re-election or not of Donald Trump will have enormous consequences for the rest of the world, but not as big as we might think, simply because the trading doesn't happen from the White House. It happens between companies.
All right, very briefly, because we're out of time. Wilson Lang, let me ask you a personal question. How do you see your future? Is it a future as a barrister who has a long career in Hong Kong, or where do you see yourself in 5-10 years?
I think it's a bit bleak at the moment. I think we're probably getting into a situation where you won't be able to really criticize the government, whether it's the Chinese government or the Hong Kong government. And it seems like at best it'll be like Singapore, but at worst it'll be the same as living within the mainland Chinese border.
Wilson Lang, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Hong Kong. I want to thank André Lozikug-Pietri in Paris, Elizabeth Broad in London. Thank you for joining us in ever greater numbers on Facebook, Twitter, and on our YouTube channel. There's more news on France24.com.
After 2 months of empty streets, schools and offices, France is lifting the lockdown. New hopes and new challenges arise as the country learns to live with the virus. Join us on France 24 for our post-confinement program.
Post-confinement on France 24 and France24.com.